Hey, 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 this is Natasha Nurse. I'm the host of Sisters on Fire IRL series, and I am really excited to be speaking with Okeoma Moronu. She is an in house attorney at a global aviation company, wife and mother of two. She hosts the Happy Lawyer Project podcast, an inspirational lifestyle podcast for lawyers looking to find happiness in life and law. When she's not researching the science of happiness, she's busy traveling the world and enjoying the good life with her adventure seeking boys. How are you?
Hi, Natasha. I am really well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, and it's been exciting to do the reverse since you had me on your podcast. I'm really excited now to turn the table and interview you. So for everyone, listening and to get everyone caught up to speed, how did you first know you wanted to be an attorney and be someone in media with a podcast? Like, how did you become the woman you are today?
Not by careful planning. I'll put that out there. um, so this is probably not the story you're supposed to tell, but to be honest with you, I became a lawyer because I had a small crush on a professor in undergrad who was a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that I'd be a good lawyer. And so take one step back. My parents are not American, and so I came to the country in high school. So going into college, I had very little kind of guidance on how to think about college and how to think about grad school and those types of things. So I was really shooting in the dark as far as figuring out my course load and things like that. So I kind of just took every class that interested me. When I graduated from college, I had taken a class in every single department at the school.
Wow.
I was really just trying to figure out what I liked and what I was good at.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pre-med for a while. And as part of being pre-med, I took a bunch of, kinesiology, physiology classes, and then found myself in a sports law class because there were a lot of athletes in those other classes, and they were taking the sports law class. And so the professor was a civil rights attorney who used to do entertainment law and really enjoyed it. So this was his way of getting back to the community and continuing to stay kind of abreast of issues in that field.
Mm-hmm.
And I did really well in that class, so he encouraged me to think about law school. And then I would say about 3 years into practicing law, I decided that I was going to be a lawyer.
That's awesome. And I love that you share that story because, not everyone's legal journey is always, well, my grandfather was a lawyer and my father's a lawyer. So of course, right? Like, yes, there's some people who know right in the womb that that's where they're going to be, but others, some of us fall into it. And then, at least, you came to terms with being it too, because so many people, they go to law school or like myself, they get try and they're like, JK, like, I was just joking, guys. Not. Let's try something different.
That's the thing is I find that it's hard to intellectualize these things. Like you have to do them to figure it out. And so abstractly, I didn't know if I would like being a lawyer or not. I know I could do it and I know I might be good at it, but there was no way for me to know if I could enjoy it other than to give it a shot and to give it a real shot. Not like, half-ass it for 6 months and then call it quits. I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to try it for X amount of time and really give it my all and see if I can make it work.
Okay.
Which is why I said it was 3 years into law before I knew I wanted to practice.
Interesting. And given your work with your podcast and kind of your pursuit of understanding the science of happiness, would you say you derive more happiness from being a lawyer or from your podcast or from traveling?
Well, I don't really derive happiness from things external. I derive happiness from doing what I want with my life. Like I find a lot of fulfillment from setting goals and achieving them in any sphere. So it's not restricted to law or podcasting or traveling. And I love all three of those things, but I think I could be just as happy doing 3 other things.
Interesting. Very cool. Okay. And how would you say your journey has been affected as a woman, your professional career as a woman, and as also as a person of color?
I would say it's been affected more by being a woman than being a person of color.
Oh, interesting.
And that's because I decided to have children quite early in my career.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of put the woman thing right out there.
Gotcha. And what was that response
And
like? Yeah.
I mean, I was very, even though I joke about not doing it intentionally, I've always been very intentional about the things I know mattered. And I've always known that having a family mattered. And so in picking where I was going to work as a lawyer, I knew that I had to work somewhere that would, at least in spirit or based on what you can discern in a 20-minute interview, be receptive to a woman who had kids. I didn't really know how to figure that out other than I only wanted to work for partners who had families. I wanted to work for partners whose wives were professionals. I wanted to work with associates who were married, who had kids, you know, and you could tell at different firms whether that was something that seemed common or uncommon.
Interesting. And how did you discern that information? Like just stalker on like the like stuff get information on LinkedIn, or how because so many people I think struggle even in trying to find like good culture fit for companies that they're looking into.
I think it's partly intuition and it's partly just being a normal person. One of the things that I've always think has been a benefit for me is that I'm authentically myself in interviews because I don't want to end up in a place that wouldn't be a good fit. So I don't tend to be someone who says what I'm supposed to say. And while I know firms are not supposed to ask me about whether I'm married or ask me about whether I have kids, once I had that offer in hand, I had second interviews. And, you know, people take you to dinner, they take you to coffee, and you say, oh, so how do you and your husband manage your schedule? And then they say, oh, I'm not married, or, oh, my husband, you know what I mean? And you just have conversations with real people about their real life. It's not like you have to interview them and say, what does your wife do? How many kids do you have? You know, it's just, you get a sense of how they speak about their family, how they speak about their life outside of the firm, how they speak about their relationship with people in the firm outside of the office, that your radar goes up if it doesn't feel authentic.
Interesting. Okay. And what would you say has been the most meaningful lesson you've learned in your career so far?
That simple things aren't always easy. I think that they're being happy as a lawyer is actually quite simple, but doesn't mean it's easy to do, and it takes work. And I don't think anyone ever taught me that my happiness would take work. I just kind of took it for granted that it would be the result of good choices. Like a byproduct, and I didn't realize it had to be the goal.
Interesting. You know, that's funny that you say that, because yeah, I mean, I think as kids, I mean, we all, you know, our happiness are all, you know, individually determined, but individualistically and determined. But for me, I didn't realize that the biggest thing that made me happy as a kid, and also what makes me happy as an adult, is autonomy of time, right? So my parents love them, but they were very neglectful. And I didn't have a babysitter ever. I only knew of that term from movies and television, because I was left alone at the age of 6. I was that obedient as a child, and I was good. You know, I would schedule my whole day for myself. I'd be like, okay, well, I'm playing Barbies till 12. I'm gonna watch HBO, which is so bad. Between 12 and 6, I'll get some dinner, you know, and read a book. And so like I created my little schedules and during the school year, during the summer. And had I been more in tune with myself, I would have realized that I wasn't just happy because I was a kid and I didn't have responsibilities, right? But it was because I controlled my schedule. And as an entrepreneur and as a creative person, the reason why I love my lifestyle is exactly why I loved my life at 6. Like that autonomy of like, oh, I don't have to ask anyone how I want to schedule my day. If I want to wake up at 5 in the morning, or if I want to take a nap at 12, it's completely under my purview. And it's interesting that, yeah, like it's interesting what if you're not in tune with yourself, how you have to like rediscover what happiness means for you, you know?
But I also love that you go back to as early as 6, because I think that it's kind of in us. Like, it's not something you have to discover as much as something you have to uncover. And sometimes people think it's external and they have to find it out there, as opposed to spend more time just listening to themselves. Like, people don't spend enough time just kind of thinking.
So true. So true. And you know why? Because I think that
people,
go ahead.
No. So many people come to me and say, how do I figure out what makes me happy? I'm like, well, you do stuff, and then you think, am I happy?
Absolutely. Right. That time for reflection. Yeah. But I think that the reason, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the reason I think that people struggle on that reflection time is because that's usually not, I think, purported as a thing to do, right? Like, just doing nothing isn't an actual thing, but like reading a book or watching a show or listening to a podcast or writing a blog or starting a side hustle or starting your own practice. Like, these are all quantifiable things that one should do as a part of the journey of whatever you define as success or your life. But people don't say, hey, did you schedule time to sit and do nothing? Right? Like, I've never been told or asked if that was a thing for me to do, which it in actuality is an actual activity. Like, time with self is actually something you have to mandate in your schedule on, if not a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. Sit and just do nothing and think about, how did this week go? How am I feeling? What am I feeling right now? Right? All of that stuff.
And to your point about feelings, I think it's about developing complex understandings about how you feel about stuff. Because I think people just kind of throw things into general categories of good and bad, or, I'm so overwhelmed, I'm so anxious, this makes me happy. Like, they say, like, watching Netflix, binge watching Netflix makes them happy. But I'm like, does it? And like, because that feeling you get when you like overindulge, and you just kind of feel guilty, that you no longer feel happy about the decision. And to be able to recognize that feeling in yourself and to have subtle clues, like, I'm very in tune to like what happens in my body when I know I've gone too far, and I get this pit in my stomach when I know that I've like spent just more time than I probably should have watching House Hunters International, and so whenever I go on vacation, especially like, as you know, I'm traveling for work, and I'll watch a lot of HGTV. And the first one or two, I'm like, wow, this is really indulgent and nice. But then once it cuts into my sleep, I no longer feel good about it. And I think sometimes people don't develop this like ability to respond to themselves. So I would just, in addition to kind of taking that time to reflect, it's also to develop a language around different responses you have to stimuli and to different experiences. I even encourage people, you can just sit down and like think kind of deeply about things. Like, when you think about yourself as a partner as a law firm, how do you feel? Like, just what are the feelings that you feel about that reality as you start to imagine yourself coming in every morning, billing the hours you need to bill? For some people, they like break out in sweat like immediately. And so that might not be the right response. But then when you think about going on a vacation, like, you immediately feel light, uplifted. But then if you think about going on a vacation for 2 months, does that still sound good to you? And
Interesting.
And what does your body do when things start to sound bad? Because when you know those responses, that also helps you to react more quickly when people offer you opportunities. Sometimes when people offer you opportunities, you have that pit in your stomach, or you have that sweaty feeling, or you have that clammy hand feeling. And the more you know what your body's trying to tell you, the easier it is to kind of give an intuitive response to whether or not that's the right opportunity for you. And I think sometimes we over-intellectualize opportunities, and we make the pros and cons list, but in our gut, we know whether or not the result would be something we'd actually want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And recently I was traveling and I did think of you because, you are kind of the traveling queen, right? And I actually really enjoyed the time away. I actually wrote about it. I'll be sharing that shortly actually. And it was wonderful to travel, and I think the greatest thing that I learned was just that time with self. I purport that yes, everyone should be doing it, but it's always easier to tell people what to do than to actually put it into practice for yourself. And when you are forced to have to kind of like be your own client and effectuate everything that you want for others onto yourself, it was glorious. It was really it was wonderful. And especially when you're in another country where people are nicer, like it was a really good experience. And with that, I guess what I'd want next for you to kind of, if we could switch gears a little bit, would be if you could talk about a little bit about maybe what has been the biggest challenge in your life, and maybe elaborate how how race hasn't played a role in your professional career, because I think it's always interesting for people to hear about that narrative, because we all have different experiences as women, as people of color. And if you could talk a little bit more about that.
It's interesting that you kind of pair that with the race question, because I think I would actually have said that that's been the hardest thing,
Mm.
is having it not impact my experience makes it hard sometimes for me to find community.
Huh.
I think sometimes people want me to have a story that I don't have, and I've been really lucky. Like had really great mentors. I've had just this kind of really accepting legal career where I've
Mhm.
always had really strong advocates in my corner. I built really good relationships above, laterally below me with my fellow lawyers. And I personally never felt that race was an issue.
Mm.
And I have done a lot of thinking and reflecting on this. And I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that not growing up in the US, I didn't kind of inherit a lot of the race dynamics.
Mhm.
And having moved a lot growing up, I think I'm just very accustomed to assimilating.
Mhm.
So, we talk about people of, minorities and even white men having to cover when they're at a firm or working in a professional environment because they don't feel like they can be their authentic self.
Mhm.
And as someone who has had to move through various kind of cultures, environments, I don't feel such a cognitive dissonance
Mm.
because it's always been the case that I've had to assimilate to multiple environments. Like on any
Mhm.
given day growing up, I could be speaking one of 5 languages. Like it just was normal to me that to act this way in some places and this way in other places. So it didn't
Mhm.
feel as much as I was like leaving some part of who I was at the door.
Mhm.
And so
Interesting.
it has been hard because I do think that I get a lot of opportunities to speak on panels or to, participate in retreats and things like that around these issues. And I never feel like I have that much to contribute just because they haven't played a huge role in my life. And so that can be challenging. I find that a lot of
Mhm.
the communities that I do feel most at home in tend to be kind of cobbled together. But
Mhm. Mhm.
um, they don't tend to come together based on kind of gender lines or racial lines or kind of that type of demographic.
Interesting. Do you feel less connected to the community of, like, the community of people of color here, because kind of like what you're saying, that because you don't have like this horrible sad story of like, well, this person said this, right? And God bless you, right? Like, as a person who grew up in this country, I race was made apparent to me at the age of 6. 6 was a very traumatic year for me. It really was the beginning of everything. And uh you know, from my, like, from someone like me, where I wish I could, you know, say that wasn't my narrative, but having multiple incidents of race, do you feel like your experience as a person of color here then is kind of stigmatized because it's like you don't want to maybe make, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that you don't necessarily have trauma stories to share, right? And you're not wearing your trauma badge on your shoulder. So then do you feel scrutinized because of that?
No, I don't think that I've been very lucky. I
Mhm.
think that people are understanding. I think it kind of helps that I didn't grow up in the States. Do you know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
that, at least for most people, rings as possibly true. Like my parents, I'm biracial, so even in my own household, like no one's the same race. um,
Yeah.
Even now, I'm in a interracial relationship, so even my own house now is the same way. So it's always been my experience, and I I think people have actually been quite understanding.
Hmm.
I Strangely enough, because I grew up kind of closer to my mom's side, I find myself being more drawn to kind of Asian cultural groups because I grew
Hmm.
up culturally Asian, and so that's also interesting.
Very cool. Awesome.
um, but it's always interesting because when you join a new firm, they send you kind of a here are what the diversity groups we have, and
Eh,
obviously the African American group is like, hey, this is when we meet, and I'm like, what about the Asian group? When do they meet? I was like, what?
aw.
And I'm like, I like my bubble tea. Like, don't leave me out.
Oh
Um,
no. Very nice.
and
Did they have, were multiple groups represented at your firm?
yeah, so and
Good.
I was part of the Asian, Asian Pacific group, and quite active in that group. And for me, ultimately, I ended up working in our office in Singapore and being really close
Wow.
to a lot of the Asian female partnership. And I have never been afraid to ask for what I want. Um, and again, I caveat all of this with like the cloak of privilege that I'm quite aware that I carry. Um,
Hmm.
I think that if you look and sound a certain way and have certain credentials, it gets you in certain doors. So I'm not
Hmm.
acting like I'm unaware of that fact.
Hmm. Hmm. That's good. I mean, we all have different privileges, right? There's privileges for being black, there's privileges for being a woman, there's privileges for being white. There's, every race, every organization, every group has a privilege, but then there are also uh quote unquote things that people can deem as a disadvantage, or what other people might think as a disadvantage, and put that onto others. And that's where the conversations become very interesting amongst people and human beings in general. But I'm glad that you shared that story, and I'm glad that you shared kind of your perspective, because I think that what the biggest thing with Sisters on Fire IRL series is that we want to highlight women who are obviously badass and authentically themselves, like you are, but also to share your story, because I think that everyone has their own way of how they arrived at who they are in the moment, and they all have different versions of how they define success, what certain challenges have been for them. And the only way for people to understand humanity is for us to talk about it, right? And for us to share, who are you, right? Like what's been going on in your life, right? Because that allows people our age, younger, to know and have some type of guideline for themselves. Because sadly in schools, I don't know if they focus as much on like life development as they do as on like academic development. But ultimately, it helps to know calculus and this, that, and English and all this other stuff. But you also have to know how to live, right? And like you have to know how to like you're saying, like how do you get in tune with yourself? How do you know what you want, right? That's not coming out of a history book. That's going to be coming out of the people like yourself who can share insight and wisdom as to how they became themselves, to say, oh, well, that makes sense, that's really cool, right? And then that's the information and the content needed in this space. So I guess with that was a lot. I like to have monologues in life. Um, my next question for you would be, uh, as as a part of the series, how would you define the term "sister on fire"?
I think that, to me, that term means somebody who's living big, and
Mm.
big doesn't look the same for everybody.
Mhm.
Um, but it's making those big, bold decisions about how you live your life and doing it. And I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that means, being super rich or being super famous or being, you know, the CEO of this or on the front cover of that. But for some people, it's having the courage to walk away from all that and just raise your family. For some people, it's
Absolutely.
having the courage to, walk away from a marriage. For some people, it's the courage to choose not to have children. I think there's so many things that are imposed upon us, and we're told what a big life looks like. And so I think that you're most on fire when your life is kind of lighting you up. And that's going to look
Mm,
different for every single person.
I love it. Okay. And in your life, either personally or professionally, who were women that lived up to that term for you?
Oh my goodness. That is such a hard question. Oh, there's so many. A couple of the women who have really inspired me kind of lately. Oh my gosh, there's so many. I will try to keep this list short. I'm trying to think of whose name I haven't given credit to recently.
Mhm.
I've been really inspired by Robin Arzon recently. I just
Mhm.
find her really phenomenal, and her energy, and as a former attorney who's now turned into kind of like a Peloton ultra celebrity spokesperson,
Mhm.
that transition has been really intriguing to me.
Mm.
And I think in following her, she's just very inspirational about living a life on purpose and really putting yourself first. Because I think
Mm.
sometimes as women, we can feel like, if, especially in our profession as lawyers, we go into it thinking we're going to help people. And so when you move away from that to something that seems less obviously like helping people,
Mhm.
it can feel selfish or shallow or flaky, unintellectual.
Mhm.
And I think people are really afraid to make that move. And she's done it so seamlessly and with such like fire. She
Mhm.
just came out kind of roaring in the field, and I've been really impressed by that.
I love it. Okay, very cool. And with that, just last couple of questions. Just advice that if you could help someone listening right now who maybe isn't as in tune with themselves, is trying to figure out how to be their best authentic self, what advice do you have for them? And then what's the best way for people to get in touch with you, learn more about your platform? And of course, if you have anything upcoming that you want to announce, feel free.
Of course. Yeah, it's always hard to give advice because everybody's needs are so different. But I think that if you're really struggling to figure out kind of who you are, who you're trying to be, you have to remember that that's not figured out kind of in your mind. I think
Mhm.
sometimes we believe that we can do enough informational interviews and we can read enough kind of self-help, or we can listen to enough podcasts, and all of these things are wonderful inputs. But at the
Mhm.
end of the day, the only way you're going to know who you are is if you ask yourself those questions and if you take the time and learn the skills of listening to yourself.
Mm, I love it. Absolutely.
Uh, yeah, and so if you want to hear more of that kind of made up advice, you can always catch me. I have a weekly podcast where I interview lots of lawyers, and we mostly just chat about life and kind of these type topics, which I so enjoy discussing. Comes out every Tuesday. It's called the Happy Lawyer Project, and you can find it anywhere podcasts are found. And if you want to follow me, Instagram's the best place to find me. I respond to every one of my DMs. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me there at the Happy Lawyer Project.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for your great wisdom. As always, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You just have an amazing insight on life, as well as just a really great attitude. So I know everyone listening loved it. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a sister on fire.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. It was really my pleasure.